And I think what we really want to do here is change the default color across the board. The default color in the browser is black, and there's no place in our mockup that uses black. So setting the default to this gray seems reasonable at this point. We're of course still going to override the color with white in some scenarios, but the bulk of our textual content will still be this gray. So what I'm going to do is cut this color property, and we'll go up and we'll paste it into this universal selector. And let's remove the color from the other portions of our content, at least wherever it's gray. So we'll skip these whites. We'll scroll down, cut it out here, cut it out here. Again, this is the slight variation on the gray that we're going to standardize, and then we'll cut it out here. And then finally, we're using this gray in the anchor tag inside of our attribution paragraph. Now, if we remove this color property, will the link continue to be gray because of the universal selector? Well, let's see. I'll save this. Go back to the browser and refresh. If we scroll down, we can see that our gray is being applied across the board, which on one level is a good thing. But what's bothering me a little bit is that we're changing the color of this link here. Now previously, we were saying specifically that we wanted this link to be gray because likely it's going to be different than the rest of the links on the page. But now because we're using that universal selector, all of our links are going to be gray as well. Now this in itself isn't a big deal because chances are we will want to adjust the colors of our links anyway, but it's kind of the canary in the coal mine. It's an indicator that maybe there are other typographical elements that we're not using yet that we might inadvertently affect because we're setting styles on a universal selector. So maybe it would make more sense to try to be as specific as we can. Instead of using the universal selector, maybe we can select just specific typographical elements that we want to adjust the styles of. So what would that look like? Well, let's go back to our styles.css file, and here we have the universal selector. We've added 3 definitions to it. Now before, when we had this set to body, let's set that back to body again, the font family sans serif was persisting nicely through all of the elements. The font weight was being overridden by the headings, and while we didn't have the color before, we would find that the color would persist until it ran into elements where the color was being specified by the browser style sheet. So for example, if we went back to the browser and refreshed, you'd see that the links now have the default blue color. I'm going to jump back to the code. So if we wanted to be a little bit more careful, we could start by applying styles that we want to override the defaults of in the body tag. That still allows the browser to override in certain areas where it makes sense. So for example, it makes sense to have blue links by default, and it makes sense to have bold headers by default. There are other places where the browser will set some reasonable defaults in elements that we haven't used yet and that you may not use until much later. So it makes sense to take advantage of those where we can, and setting styles on the body is a good way to do that. Now, when there's areas where we want to make a more aggressive override, it might make sense to do that in separate contexts that make sense for when we want to make the override. So for example, we want this color on some very specific links. So I'll add it back into this snippet attribution set of selectors. So now when we go to the browser and refresh, we'll see our gray right here. So that's good. Now the other thing that we want to see is a different font weight on headings. So the way we can do that is by specifying headings directly. So here's body. Let's add another selector under it. And right now we're using H2 tags and H3 tags. And let's set the font weight to 100 for both of these. If we save this and go back to the browser and refresh, all of our headings now use the thin font weight. So the difference in what we have now versus what we had when we were using the universal selector is that now we know specifically where we're applying these styles. We're trusting the browser to make some sensible choices for specific elements, and whenever we run into a situation where the browser's choices don't line up with our design's choices, then we'll override those defaults specifically for those elements. Now remember, we're being very particular about what styles we're setting for default HTML tags. Before, we talked about not using HTML element selectors directly, but the reason for that was that we wanted to be able to keep our HTML flexible. We wanted to be able to change an H2 to an H3 and maintain its styles. What we're doing here is very different. We're basically overriding the browser's default styles whenever we find that we're overriding them more than not. This is going to keep our CSS leaner, so less lines of code, and it will set some reasonable defaults for elements that we haven't used yet.